Well, good morning. Right, so it's lunchtime. So I appreciate that I can be here and talk about basic things in plant ecology. I thank the university for inviting me, and I thank you for your interest. I just want to make sure that you really are not shy. You really call out when I'm too fast or when I'm using terms that you're not familiar with. Please do interrupt me. And I do appreciate that with the English skills in the room, I guess we will have a difficulty getting through the whole program. So we will see how far we get. I'm not going to push it. Today's topic is rather basic to ecology. It's almost a philosophical topic. We will talk about the foundations of ecology, and that includes animals. That's not just plant-specific. It's rather basic. So today we will talk about limitation and stress. And the two terms are possibly the most frequently used words in ecology. And you will see people are using them not in a straightforward concept. And today I want to clarify what is stress, what is limitation. And you will see it's going to be very difficult. First, I guess you all have heard in physics that there are some basic rules of thermodynamics. You may remember them from school, the first law and the second law. And physics is an old science. It goes back centuries. Ecology is a young science. And we don't have these rigid, very basic laws. But I think two we can formulate similar to physics right up front. I call them the basic rules. First is the reproductive potential of any species is bigger than what the environment can support. So you can produce more offspring, so the reproductive power is greater than what the environment can support. And that obviously leads to limitation, to a limited carrying capacity per unit land area, and thereby a limitation. And that's why I believe ecology is the science of housekeeping. If something is limited, you need to care for its use. Second, two species can only coexist in space over time if they are slightly different in using resources. If everybody is using exactly the same resources, exactly at the same time, exactly at the same space, they compete with each other. So if one species has its roots there, and another species has the roots there, it's fine. This species is using the nutrients and water there, and the other one is there. Or if one species is there, does its job, and then gets dormant, and then the next species comes in and uses a different window in time. And so on. This is the concept of niche. In English, the word niche means, this is a niche, so now I'm in a niche. And we use the same word for a more abstract niche. It's the preference of a certain species for certain nutrients, water, temperature, time, and many other coordinates. They define the ecological niche. And we think every species, including us humans, has its niche. Just imagine if we had no clothes, where on the planet, and no heating and no air conditioning, where on the planet would be our niche? You would probably find a very cozy and warm part of the world where we could live without behavioral adjustment. So every species has a niche, and outside that niche it cannot exist. But inside the niche there are perfect optimal conditions and marginal conditions at the edge. So housekeeping is one thing, and the niche is the other thing. I believe limitation and stress are the most misunderstood terms in ecology. I can quote you a textbook, and I think on the next slide I quote this book by Osmond et al. And Barry Osmond is a good friend of mine, and he was not bad intended. He just got it wrong. Up front in the book, he defined what is stress. And he said stress is any departure from optimal life conditions. You need to digest this. It's any departure from optimal life conditions in the sense of maximum growth. That's complete nonsense. Because this is just another word for life. Because if you expose an organism to a maximum growth rate, most organisms on this planet would die shorter or later. If we just eat, we get heavier and heavier and heavier, and in the end, so this is maximum growth rate. So in fact, we are only fit if we are exposed to some limitation, on and on. If it's too hot, if it's too cold, if it's too dry, we are hungry, we are thirsty, physical stress, all sorts of constraints make us healthy. So if you consider all these things as stressful, then you have just invented a new word for life, for good life. So that makes no sense. So what then is stress? It must be something that goes beyond everyday business. It must be something severe. And so Walter Lache and others have separated two terms of stress. One they call eustress, which is the conditioning stress, which is the healthy stress that we need every day to live. And the other one is distress, is the destructive stress, where plants lose leaves, where some part of their body fades away. So we need to make a distinction between conditioning and destructive stress. And I think stress is just an extreme form of limitation. So limitation is the basic thing. We are always limited by something. And if this limitation gets extreme or severe, then we may use the word stress. You know, it comes from physics, then it made its way to medicine, and then stress seeped into psychology. We know all examination stress. You know? And then from there it came into biology. So it's actually, its roots are in physics. So I'm showing you a few slides. Actually, I should have moved those slides ahead. I'm sorry, I did not. So we have gone through that, but you have a handout. So stress is an extreme form of limitation. So stress would equal life if any factor that leads to a reduction in growth and reproduction in stress. That makes no sense at all. You have it on your handout. So let me discuss this. Are these plants stressed? Well, we have a case in the Sahara Desert. We have a case in high mountain plants. And we have a place in the Salt Lake in Utah in the US. Plants growing in pure salt. You know, you can see that we are transporting our human perception of what is stressful to us onto those organisms. So these desert plants, they could not grow outside there in the park. They need a desert, and then they are happy. And the alpine plants, if you bring them to a botanical garden, most of them will die rapidly. And if you start watering the salt lake and remove the salt, these species would disappear. So it's very dangerous to use our own perception of what is stressful to us and impose that on organisms that have selected certain locations in the landscape for their life. So the question is, what happens if we remove what we think is stressful? I think I had a slide here. No, I moved it out. So just imagine you go to the Sahara and you take a fire brigade hose and you just water. You can create a jungle there. And the species that are now there, they will be gone. So by removing the stress, you would kill the species. So how could that be a stress? Or go to the alpine, you heat the alpine. I mean, plants from lower elevation will come in and grow over. So the alpine, you're killing the alpine by warming. And if you then water the salt lake, you get meadows and forests, and none of these species would ever live there again. So, what an observer may consider stressful, like us, in what I call late successional communities. These are communities where the species arrived, where evolutionary selected, and only the ones that found the right niche and are fit stayed. So this is a location that species selected by themselves. Nobody planted them. They came there, and if the conditions were bad, they were gone out. And only the ones who like it are there. This is what I call a successional process. And if you remove that stress, you remove that species and that community. But that brings me to a rather fundamental question. If we water this plant, it's going to disappear from the desert. If we warm that plant, it's going to disappear where it is. And that, I believe, is the biggest confusion that entered the science of ecology. People confuse things. A community of species, which means the mixture of genes in space over time, is never limited or stressed. Never. But each individual in that community always has a neighbor that also needs resources. So there's always limitation for an individual. There's no individual on this planet that is not limited, and there's no community on this planet that is limited. You see the difference? Maybe that's the central point of this morning. Because that means communities are never stressed and never limited. Because if you remove the stress, you will have winning and losing species. So whenever you change only slightly, it's like a spider net. You have a spider net, and if you pull the strings, you're changing the life conditions. And some new species will come in, and other species go out. So the concept of limitation must never be applied to a community. But it is always true for an individual or for general productivity. So if I close my eyes, I don't care which species is growing there. I just harvest and put it on a balance. Say, how many grams per meter square biomass? Then almost any ecosystem is limited. So maybe you realize that the concept of limitation actually comes from agriculture. Because a farmer has only one species on the field, maybe potato, maybe wheat, and the farmer is interested in a big yield. And if the yield is not big, then the crop is limited by water, by nutrients, and that agronomic concept seeped into ecology, and ecologists didn't realize. They used a concept that has its value in agriculture, they used it in ecology. But in ecology it makes no sense at all. If we care for biodiversity, for species presence, species mix, there is no limitation. But if we just say, okay, I don't care which species is growing there, I just harvest, then there's always limitation. So it depends how you define your terms. And that's maybe a general lecture. Much confusion in science in general came in because people did not define their terms. It's like the Babylonian Confucian. So people talk side by side. I can give you many other terms that simply have not been defined, like we will later on come to tree line ecology, the upper limit of forests. I can tell you this is a 100-year debate in science, simply because people did not define what is a tree and what is a line. It sounds trivial, But it's the beginning of science is have a clear terminology. And so that's why I start this lecture by making a clear point about limitation and stress, because they are so central. So, this meadow with orchids in it, it's nutrient poor and it's dry. But this doesn't mean that community is stressed. This just means that under these conditions, this is the perfect place for these species. And if you start fertilizing, I mean, you make a lush meadow, you can harvest more hay, you can feed more cows, but these species are gone. So it's really important to make that distinction between yield, which is the amount of biomass, and who is playing the game, who is there. So, I'm summarizing this. There is no resource limitation of communities. And any change in resource supply will change the community. So when you consider the Arctic tundra, you know, in the Arctic, people have to, the Arctic tundra is nutrient limited. Okay, please fertilize it. And if you do, you can produce a lush green meadow in the Arctic tundra. And the Arctic plants, well, they're gone. So how could the Arctic tundra be nitrogen limited? People didn't say, I mean biomass production. Well, that's another story. You got the point? I think it's a very important point. So a wheat field with one species is optimized for yield. And it's almost always limited because at some point it gets crazy. If you put more fertilizer, you could get even more yield, but it doesn't pay off. So there's a limit. But it's always, in terms of mass production, it's always limited. I mean, in Georgia, I believe wheat production will be somewhere around 3 to 4 tons per hectare. But you can push it up to 30 tons per hectare with absolutely crazy amounts of nutrients and water and herbicides and everything. You can do all sorts of crazy things. So by principle, an agricultural crop is always limited. Well, a given community is never limited. If you change resources, you change the community. So how can you then say the community was limited if you change it and a new community occurs? Here you are. I mean, I took that picture in the Arctic. You see an Arctic tundra, and somebody put fertilizer on it. You can see you can make a nice meadow. We did this in the Swiss Alps. The left picture is a little cushion plant on a glacier forefield, very close to the glacier, to the ice. And then we added fertilizer because people told me, this is a 15-year-old picture, people told me, in the cold, nutrients don't matter. These plants have so many problems with the low temperature. If you add nutrients, it makes no difference. Nobody had an answer. So we put a lot of nutrients. I think we put 100 kilograms of nitrogen, which is an astronomical amount. What happens is, in 1 year, this changes from here to here. And the cushion plant was underneath and overgrown by grasses. So, I mean, you're not old enough to know Fujifilm. Maybe you remember, before we had digital cameras, we buy film in boxes. And in the shops, there was always Kodak, Agfa, Fujifilm. Now, the Fujifilm box had a terrible green color. So I call it Fuji green. And I tell you, that glacier, you could see from 1 kilometer. It was the brown, gray glacier forefield, and we had 5 replicate 1 meter square plots. You could see from 1 kilometer 5 Fuji green squares on the glacier forefield, where we added the nutrients. So the nutrients completely changed the system, and the cushion plant has no chance. It's overgrown and it will disappear. And this is done by humans when they put cattle on in the mountains, and the cattle rest and shit. There's a lot of nutrients in one place, and if you do this for several years, you create an enormous nutrient stock, and you change the tiny little alpine community need to tall herbs, and even when people don't put any cattle there, after 50 years, you still can see that. So you really transform the system when you change the resources. And we should not call this a stress or a limitation, because it's the vital condition under which certain species can exist.
But can we call global warming a limitation for alpine plant communities also?
When you consider environmental change like global warming, like nitrogen deposition, like CO2 enrichment, like UV problem, I think this is all a slow change of the resource conditions, and communities will change. So we see in Central Europe a clear trend towards a nitrophilization of the vegetation. In Switzerland, they have a biodiversity monitoring program where in every 10-kilometer point they revisit the same area, and they found that the species they find now compared to 10 years ago are more nitrophilous, more nutrition demanding. So there is a trend on the long term, and if it's warmer or if it's drier, you will see some species that are now operating at their edge. They will be kicked out and new species will come in. It's a slow process, because I believe if a plant community is in a steady state adjustment to its environment, any change, temperature, water, nutrients, will change the community. So a change in community means you have a new community and the old community is gone. So the old community cannot have been limited. That's the central point. But its productivity may go up, but that's a different story. So we make a distinction between an ecological optimum and the most abundant place. So if you find a species very abundant and not there, you think, this is the best place for the species. But every species has a neighbor, and it's only the best species to the degree that the neighbor permits. So there's always a separation of what would be the best for an individual species with no neighbors and the species in reality with neighbors. And so we make a distinction between an ecological and a physiological optimum. So it's misleading if you find a species very abundant in one place, this is the physiologically optimum condition. It may actually be a marginal condition. But other species do better under these conditions. So the species is not physiologically at its maximum. It's a very important, rather basic distinction. And let me show you a work I did when I was a PhD student. I studied plant-water relations on a mountain near Innsbruck in Austria, where I come from. And at that time we had the Olympic Games in Austria, in Tyrol, and they were fertilizing the snow, because then the snow, when they make ski runs, gets more solid. If you put salt in snow, it gets colder and more solid. It's a salt-ice mixture, temperature gets down. And I was wondering what happens to the alpine vegetation after the Olympic Games, when the snow is melting and all the fertilizers on those slopes. So what I did when I went up to my field site with my water relations work, I always had a little bag with nutrients, and every year, over 3 years, I put some fertilizer on little plots. It was not a scientifically serious experiment. I just was curious. And you can see a little plant, which was the plant I worked during my PhD. It's called Loiseleuria procumbens. It's a little small ericaceae, only 2 centimeters big, and forms carpets. And if you fertilize it, it's really, you can make it gigantic. The leaves became twice as big, the plant became twice as high. So obviously, that plant in an agronomic concept was nutrient limited, because it grew less under natural conditions, and if I add fertilizer, it grows more. So if I take the concept from agronomy, I would say, yes, this plant was nutrient limited. And just when I was about to finish my PhD in spring, I went up the mountain, and then I saw, Jesus, what had happened? exactly the area where I was fertilizing, most of the shoots and leaves were dead, overgrown by a fungus, by snow mold, which is a sort of mold fungus. But it was only the area that I had fertilized, not outside. So by pushing the growth of that species, I reduced its fitness for a certain condition in spring when the snow melts, when it's very wet, and all those big guys, they were killed. This is just one example. Just imagine any plant that has more nutrients in a meadow. It would be a little bit taller. It would be more likely to be eaten. If you start fertilizing mountain plants, you make them sensitive to fungal disease, to freezing resistance. Their phenology gets changed. They don't produce nice winter buds. They go green into the winter, some summer greens. So if you take the agronomic concept of limitation and you remove that limitation, you commonly kill a species. This is just one avenue, but there are many different ways. So strength and fitness in evolution is not defined by body size or growth rate, but as you know, it's only defined by successful reproduction. So in evolution, the only thing that counts is whether you transferred your genes to the next generation. Whether you are small or whether you are big doesn't matter at all. It's all about persistence and reproduction, and not how big or fat you are or how prominent you are. The more prominent you are, usually, the more likely you are eaten or thrown over by wind as a tree. So the optimization theory should not be taken from agronomy when we talk about ecology. Now, there's one thing which is very often confused. We now clarified stress and limitation, and now I bring in another term, the term disturbance. And I'll just give you a few examples why I think these two terms must never be confused. Disturbance is a physical removal of biomass. Stress and limitation are physiological constraints to growth. These are my 4 examples. So when there's a fire, biomass is burned off. Well, there may be heat stress before, but usually that's a short moment and then it's burned. Erosion is a disturbance. Wind throw is a disturbance. Grazing by animals or by any herbivory, even small beetles or snails, is a disturbance. That's not a stress. That's very important. Phil Grime made that point years ago, the big English ecologist. He said, please don't confuse stress or limitation with disturbance. So again, we talk about terminology. Don't confuse these two terms. Some species need disturbance for existence. Can you think of an example? Which type of vegetation always needs disturbance?
Grassland.
Yes, thank you. Grassland. There would be no grassland without disturbance. Grasses and herbs in grassland are designed to match disturbance. How and why? Because the meristems are below ground. And you can go with a lawnmower over the lawn and they will always regrow. But whenever you stop mowing, other species will come in that have their meristems on top. Shrubs, trees, and grow over. So there are no natural, hardly any natural grassland except the big steppe situations where it's too dry for trees. But all the grassland around Tbilisi, most of the grassland in the, I think almost all the grassland in the Caucasus below the tree line are man-made by disturbance, by grazing. That's a new ecosystem over hundreds of years, new ecosystem developed. But they will disappear, and they will disappear if you don't keep disturbing them. The prairie, I mean, if you think of the tall grass prairie with the buffalo, they have 1,000 to 200 millimeters of rainfall, but you need only 300 millimeters of rainfall for a forest. And in fact, In some pockets you see forest, but there's this wonderful prairie. How could that happen? There's enough water. It came into place through the interaction of fire and bisons. So the fire kicks off all the buds of young trees that try to make it, and the bison keeps the grass by disturbing it. So it's a bison fire-driven system, and it has nothing to do with physiology, why we have a prairie rather than a forest. But if you take out the fire, if you take out the bison, well, you have a forest, a lush forest, a big forest. Let me close this first introductory lecture by a very specific case now on how we can sharpen our definitions of what is stress tolerance. I talked now about stress and limitation, and you understood the difference between agronomy and ecology, and I made clear that disturbance is not the same as stress. And now let me take a specific example for stress, which is either drought or freezing stress. There are other stresses, but this is a good example, and I'm trying to make you familiar with a language. And the language is not just language, it's a clear distinction between different ways plants can avoid or resist to be stressed. I should have a stick here. I think the pointer here is not... Well, I can use the pointer. So we define first stress, which could be frost or drought, and then there needs a perception. So there's a stressor, this is the agent that is creating the stress, and then the organism must be able to perceive it. Yes, for me it's easier if I can use the pointer, but...
Don't do.
I use the pointer. It's fine, thank you very much. So, we have a case where we say an organism, this can be an animal or a plant, is generally unable to deal with it. It's always lethal, it's always going to die. So there's zero resistance, tolerance, no way. Alternatively, species can cope with the situation. But there are now, as you will see, different ways how you can cope with it. One is you escape. You go away when it's bad. Annual plants, they produce a seed, and the seed is surviving the dry summer and waits for the next rain. That's escape. Or tulips. They like spring weather, and they don't like the hot summer. They flower, they put some leaves out, they fill their bulbs, and then they pull in. So they escape. Or you don't escape, you stay there, you don't go below ground, or you don't go away and you don't go to sleep, you stay there. And then there are still two ways how you can cope with that stressful situation. And one is that we call avoidance. Hello. One is what we call avoidance. That means the stressor is the wrong classroom. Yeah? No problem. So avoidance means there's a stressor, there's perception, there's no escape, the plant is there, the stress is operating on it, but the plant avoids that the stress becomes physiologically significant. This is the example of a cactus. A cactus is just a water tank, and as long as there's water in the tank, it can be dry, it can be very dry, but the cells inside the tank are happy. Once the tank is empty, well, then the game is over. But usually the tank is big enough that there's actually no stress sensed by the individual cell. It's always moist inside the cactus. There may be a little bit less moisture, but it's always there. That's a way of avoiding that the stress becomes active, or is freezing resistance. But most people don't know that the trees out there, the water in the stem is not freezing when it's -5 degrees. How is that possible? We learned water freezes at 0 degrees. Well, nature has invented tricks to prevent that from happening. We call this a metastable state of water. Against what we believe are the laws of physics, water can be liquid down to minus 40 degrees. It's a miracle. People have found certain proteins in the xylem sap help facilitating this gel-type status with no ice crystals. I think some Japanese have a patent on those proteins. They have high commercial value if you can prevent freezing from happening, not by putting salt in. It's not a de-icing on the street. It's water that stays in a gel-like stage, not frozen. In leaves, this can be pushed down to minus 12 degrees if species are able to perform what we call supercooling. For instance, tropical alpine plants who never see freezing more than minus 10 degrees, minus 12 degrees, they perform supercooling. This means they prevent water from freezing to ice crystals, because if ice crystals are in a cell, this is always killing. So no plant can survive ice crystals inside the protoplast. But if you manage that you're not freezing by some trick, this is called supercooling, you are avoiding the problem. You see, this is what we call avoidance. The stress is there, it's operating, the plant is perceiving it, but it has tricks for its deadly role not to become realized. And finally we come to real resistance in case of freezing. This means the plant does freeze, but the trick is where exactly does it freeze. If it freezes inside the cell, it's killing. So our plants in the mountains that survive freezing because they have found a trick to handle the reduction of temperature by forming the ice only between the cells, outside. You know, the cell wall is like a blotting paper full of water, very little solutes. So if it gets cold, the ice is formed first outside the cell where there's no solution. And as these ice crystals forms, they suck water from the protoplast and they grow and fill the intercellular space. So thereby the protoplast is shrinking and gets more and more concentrated. So it won't freeze. And freezing consumes energy. So as these ice crystals take water out of the protoplast, they grow, the protoplast is shrinking and is not freezing. That means a plant can only survive freezing when the membranes permit water transport. At minus 20, minus 30 degrees, you need very special membranes. You all know if you have olive oil and you put it in a too cold freezer, the olive oil gets almost stuck. So lipids are very sensitive to temperature, and you know the basic membrane of life as a lipid layer. So the trick to survive freezing is to change your lipid layer in time so that the membrane remains fluid. And you have these water channels, this is a protein complexes. They need to be intact to allow the water to travel out to form the ice crystals. And as the protoplast shrinks, all these delicate three-dimensional structures, these enzymes, they get folded, they stick together, and then they're damaged. So you need some paint inside to keep them in a stage. When the water comes back, they bloom up to their three-dimensional status again. And these are protective proteins and sugars, like archaeologists are using them when they do excavations. They use gypsum or some plastic material to save structures. So you need these saving, protecting agents in the protoplast. You need the water channels being active, and you need a certain membrane. This is, in one example, how plants achieve true resistance. So you see, the terminology is quite important, what we mean by avoidance, escape, resistance, and what is resistance. Unless you have a clear terminology, there's no scientific debate. So I give you examples. These are all resistances by escape. Annual plant life or shedding leaves. If you cannot tolerate freezing, you shed your leaves in fall. Or the bulbils of Mediterranean gladiolus. This is all resistance by avoidance. I mentioned the supercooling in tropic alpine plants, the supercooling in xylem. Xylem doesn't freeze, or hardly ever, because the ice expands, so it would break the stem, it would damage the stem. Then avoidance by in hot places. You can reflect radiation by white pubescens or thin structures. You see this white atriplex is full of salt outside, reflects the radiation, avoids the heat stress, or the cactus, or the stem or leaf succulent nature that stores a lot of water and avoids the action of stress. And resistance by tolerance means that you are allowing desiccation, you are allowing freezing to act. And I gave you one example how plants do it in case of freezing. But if you go out there, all these tree stems have algae on the stem. They are able to dry out, and they can be dry, like lichens can be dry for many years. You put a drop of water, they come back to life. So these are the truly resistant, or these resurrection plants. As I showed this Selaginella here, this is true resistance. And finally, let me say, how do plants in the long term cope when the situation changes from a non-stressful to a stressful situation? I'd like you to make a difference between three things. This relates to another dangerous term. We all talk about adaptation. Just be very careful when you talk about adaptation. When we talk about human adaptation, we mean behavior. Yeah? If it's hot, we go into the shade. We have, animal biologists have a totally different understanding of adaptation. I personally try to avoid the word adaptation because it's highly, highly confusing. There is the first step, which we call acclimation. Acclimation means in a hot summer, if you had many hot days, after some time you can cope with it physiologically. If you come from the Arctic and you are thrown immediately into a hot Mediterranean summer, you're not acclimated. So plants can acclimate very well if you put them in the shade, in your living room. They are adjusted to shade. If you put them on the balcony, you're killing them because they cannot cope with the sun. But if you do it slowly, you put them a little bit closer to the window, and finally you put them out, it's fine. They acclimated. And they can also re-acclimate. So freezing resistance can build up, and freezing resistance can build down. So you can physiologically move things. Second, modification. These are things that relate to morphology. So for instance, a leaf that was produced in the shade has only one palisade layer. You cannot decide later on if you prune the tree and the leaf is suddenly in the sun. The leaf cannot decide, now I become a sun leaf with 3 palisade layers. So the shade leaf has a problem. And if a sun leaf, a thick sun leaf comes in the shade, it cannot decide, I want to become a shade leaf. It's done. So this is a modification you can only do once in the lifespan of an organ. And finally, we have evolutionary adaptation. So I'm not using adaptation alone, I'm saying evolutionary adaptation or genetic adaptation. This means first microevolution and then in the phylogeny macroevolution. This means a selection of genotypes that can cope with a certain stress. It's important to make this distinction, and people pull it all in one box and say, well, this is adaptation. I make a clear distinction between
these terms. I just jump over this because we run out of time, and let me conclude. The most important things, the take-home message from today is, please do not confuse ecological concepts like biodiversity with agronomic concepts like yield, biomass production. These are just two different qualities of life. And just to round up the story, there's always different ways to live. So in the old days, people said there are many roads to Rome. There's not just one. Here is a single stone in an alpine situation, and on that stone you find next to each other completely desiccation-tolerant lichens. You can dry them out, keep them for years in a drawer, put water, and they start living. Then you find succulent plants that store water. They perform avoidance, so they're actually not stressed. If water is less, they still have stored water. And behind there is the classical control of water stress through physiology, with stomatal regulation and controlling water household. So there, for the same problem, there are different solutions. And if I finally try to apply what I told you today to an alpine situation, well, is there stress and limitation? I think there's no stress. If you remove the stress from alpine plants, you kill them. But there is, of course, a limitation in a physiological sense. If you warm, they would grow a little bit faster. But just give you one example. People over many years have told us how poor alpine plants are because it's so cold where they live. So they are really low temperature limited. Now, the very same people tell us if the climate is warming, these plants will be in danger. But obviously, only one of the two statements can be correct. It's not possible that you first lament that these plants are cold limited, and then you say, but if it's warm, they are even more limited. Makes no sense at all, because they were not limited there in the first place, because they were there because it's cold. If it were not cold, they were not there. Water is rarely a problem, and in no cases is it existential stress in the sense of killing. And nutrients are always limiting in the agronomic sense. So if you add nutrients, no plant, even the tropical rainforest, if you add nutrients, plants grow more. You must never take the response to nutrient addition as an indication of an ecological limitation in the first place. It's a physiological limitation in an agronomic sense, but not in an evolutionary, ecological sense. And carbon is never limiting, but that's another lecture. I hope you find it of interest, and we will take a full hour only talking about whether this world is carbon limited or not. But I felt these terminology issues should be a good start, because we need to have the same understanding of terms before we go into detail.
I have a question about resistance and tolerance.
Yeah.
Are they the same terms, or there are some different?
No, maybe language-wise I made a confusion. I think there is resistance by tolerance or avoidance, and tolerance or avoidance is the same rank. And you can resist the stress either by internally avoiding it or by internally tolerating it. Maybe I was not precise. Thank you. Okay, this is what I felt would be appropriate as an introduction, and you see the forthcoming lectures. I had 8 on my list, but Olta told me it's a bit unrealistic to go through all 8, so we made a list of priorities. We will go to 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we see how it goes, and then we jump to 8, and if time permits, we can go to 5, 6, 7. They are a bit more sophisticated topics, and it depends on your background, whether you are interested in stable isotopes, for instance. It became such a strong tool in ecology. There would be no modern ecology without those stable isotopes, I maintain. But maybe if time permits, we can take part of that and only give you some basic idea, not going through the full program. And Otto was kind enough to produce the handouts, because I think you need to make notes. And so. I always prefer paper. I think we are over time. We should finish. Thank you. So tomorrow we will talk about microclimatology and the functional approach to biodiversity. Species limitation, tree line, species boundaries. Why is it that the species stops here and doesn't go further?
Are grasses stable against stress than other species?
Grasses need disturbance. If there's no disturbance, they will be overgrown by trees below the tree line. So without disturbance, in the Miocene, grasses came in by the big ungulate herds that were grazing, combined with drought and lightning and fire. So it's really the best evolutionary product to avoid above ground biomass removal by moving your buds below ground. You can resist trampling, fire, eating. If everything that is important for your life is below ground, you just put a few leaves outside, you are robust against all these disturbances. But if you have your buds above the ground, well, you're gone if you are eaten, burned, or trampled. So grasses are really one of the big success stories on the planet. Can you, is the English okay? Am I speaking too fast?
No.
You can follow?
Yes.
Okay, I try to be explicit and slow, but sometimes I get lost. Okay, then perhaps if you have time, see you tomorrow. Yes?
Can we say that stress can help the plant survive, or it depends on weather or something?
You know, a certain degree of moderate stress makes a plant fit. So if you put the plant in a nutrient solution and in a warm growth cabinet, it may grow faster. But if the same plant would be in the field, it would die. So you need some moderate challenge every day to be strong enough. But what the problem is our anthropocentric view of stress. We feel cold, we feel dry, we think it's hot, and then we think the organisms in that environment feel the same. But for them, this is just paradise. This is why they're there. And that's why we always think, we need to water, then they have a better life. But we kill them, because others will come in that like the water, and the ones that can cope without, they are overgrown. So a certain stress is the condition under which the plant would grow there. If there were not what we think is stress, it's not stress for that plant. But what we think is stress is actually the very reason why the plant is there. And if we remove that, we remove the plant. This is just because we're using in terms of agronomy, of mass production. But evolution doesn't select for mass production, but for successful reproduction and long-term persistence. So what we consider a moderate stress is actually the very reason, the condition why a certain plant is growing here. So biodiversity is the answer of nature to the various coordinates of resource supply. It's the response to it. And if we change the resources, we produce a new community. It's very hard to get this across. I'm giving the same basic lecture also in Basel to my students. And if I talk about this on conferences, people are so in their brain in an agronomic concept of limitation. And we need an evolutionary concept of evolution. I mean, both have their right. In agronomy, sure, you need a yield concept. But in ecology, a yield mass production concept makes no sense. That's why people tell me, this grassland is water limited. It is not. It's this grassland because there is a shortage of water. It just... Okay, we need to finish.